Today on the bench, we're going to be looking at an Ingersoll-Rand 2235TiMAX half-inch air impact. This one has a stuck trigger. See how the trigger is stuck in? I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I'd say that the throttle valve stem is either broken or the catch on the trigger that travels back here to grab onto the throttle valve stem has come off of it. Because the throttle valve stem is this little metal stem. It's so tiny, I can't believe they don't break more often, that the trigger hooks onto. And if that has disconnected, that's going to happen. So that's my guess. Let's see if I'm right. The customer has already tried looking at this himself. He has removed the body screws. So we're just going to leave those here. I'm guessing the internals are okay. If the only problem he had is a trigger, he doesn't know where the release for the throttle valve is, and it is a little tricky if you don't know. So there's always some tricks to the trade, and this is one of them. Golly. Here in the handle is that slot right there, and there's a similar one on the other side. There's a spring clip that wraps around the throttle body, and it has two tabs that expand into these slots to hold the entire assembly in place. So if you don't know those are there, then you're never going to be able to get the throttle body out. So we have to depress the tabs, and then this whole thing just slides right out. And one of the reasons you don't know that there's because these always fill up with gunk. I don't know. I'm going to try to show you. I don't know if you can see it, though. In the slot, yeah, you can, right? You can see that silver piece right there that's shining on the bottom of the slot. That's the tab. It's just a flat piece of metal, so it's kind of difficult to depress it. But we're gonna see if we can, see if we can get you in focus. There we go. See if we can press that in. And while it's helpful to do both ends simultaneously, you can work this in and press it down just enough for it to catch, and then we can work the other end. We'll see if we can get it. Now, see that click was the tab going back into place, so I didn't have it pressed down enough. And the whole throttle body pulls out. Now, here's the valve stem I was talking about. It's intact. And it seems to have good movement in it, good springiness. So that may not be the problem after all. Let's see what we can find out when we look at the trigger. I don't think, no, you can't see down there. I was going to try to show you the trigger stem, but it actually looks okay. So I don't know. We're going to pull this out and see what we can find, but for some reason, it doesn't want to come out. So that might be some other completely different cause here. All right, it's not as easy as I was hoping. So we're going to take the body and the cone off and dig in a little bit further. Well, that's a little tough one to come up. We're going to dig into that one a little bit too. This might need more help than I thought. But at least want to show you how this comes apart. So once you pull those screws out, the nose comes off, and there's the screw holes from these long screws that go through the body and hold them. Be careful when you do this, because if you don't have this level, then the entire hammer assembly, which resides in here, and the anvil is going to fall out, or the motor assembly, which in here, is going to fall out. So when you separate them, lay it flat on the bench, pull them apart like that. That way nothing's falling out. And if you haven't looked into it before, then at least you're not going to get confused at how things go back together again. This is the gasket that goes between the hammer housing here, or the nose cone, and the body. Now we're going to go through this entire thing. You can see how there's a lot of old lubricant in there. Nobody that I've ever met has ever opened these up and lubricated them themselves. They always just use whatever lubrication is there from the factory, and then years and years and many hundreds of hours worth of use go by, and that lubricant breaks down. It gets gummy. It can trap and keep grit and dirt in there, and overall it affects the usability and efficiency of the gun. So what I like to do, just to make sure I'm earning my money, is clean everything up. We're going to completely disassemble this, clean everything, re-lubricate it, and in that process, we're going to find the exact cause of the trigger problem. We're going to take the hammer assembly and put that aside for now, and we're going to focus on getting the trigger out. So first thing we have to do is pull the motor, or what they call the rotor, out of here, and that is just a whole assembly that sits in here. The selector switch on the back presses into the rear of the assembly, so we just push that out and the entire thing comes out. And then this disassembles further by taking the selector off, taking this cap off, and then pulling the rotor out. Alright, let's see what's up with the trigger. Now we can see, at least from... Alright, give you bearings here. Here's a trigger. We can look down in here and see if we can see anything. But at least we can get some leverage on it and give it a good pull and see if something frees up. It's not budging. I don't know what could be keeping it in there. This isn't that complicated. I'm kind of confused. I'm trying not to get too brutal with it, hoping it comes out nice on its own, but it's made some questionable life decisions, and it's not coming out. So we got to get a little tougher with it. I took this over to the sink and washed it and got a lot of the grease and junk off of it because in the off chance that there's just something dirty in the way, I don't know. I mean, this is weird. The trigger is a very simple piece of plastic with a stem that sticks in there. if something's holding it up, it's probably some kind of foreign body or something. I'm guessing. I don't know. It's kind of a cool mystery right now. And I can't show you because I don't have any light, but if you look down in the handle, you'll see way down around, well, here, the trigger stem where it comes back. And it's just sitting there, not looking like it's held up by anything. Holy moly, that was difficult to take out. Well, just a good tug with the old Knipex pliers wrenches. Thanks, Knipex pliers wrench. You're welcome, says the pliers wrench. Because it has a mouth here, and an eye here, and it can talk. I laugh at your effort to prevent me from taking you out, Trigger. Now you're on camera and people can see you. Ha 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 ha. Alright, let's look at this. It looks good. It has an O-ring there, which is intact. That looks good. It doesn't look worn. That stem goes through that hole there. Nothing in there. That's a mystery. I don't know. Let's see if it has a problem if I put it back in there. I don't know. That's pretty weird. Let's give it a little clean it off and see what we can find out. Try a little grease on there and see if that makes it any smoother going in and out of the body. What we're going to do is put the throttle housing back in and see if that works. The trick here is when you reassemble it, make sure the trigger's back in. I really wish I could show that to you, but I just can't get a light down there where the camera can see. But you have to get the trigger far back enough that the little hook that goes around the valve stem goes through it. So as long as that's in a neutral position in there, it'll fit. You just got to make sure it gets lined up. I'm going to try something here. I'm going to remove the selector switches. And the way you do that is just put one down all the way so the other one pops up all the way. Stick something small like a pocket screwdriver, and there's a small tab on the side here. Stick that in and push, and that'll free up that tab where you can pop the selector up. I'll show you on this one. Is in this side here, closest to the center. Make sure it's up all the way. Stick something in there. Pry it just a little bit to clear that tab, and then work it out. Now I can remove the I don't know what they call it. It's the thing that dictates the direction of the airflow depending on which selector you have chosen. I'm going to pop this out. It pushes down and through the body of the tool because I want to inspect to see if there's any damage here, because something's hanging up that trigger and I can't tell what it is. So I figured while I'm in there, I'll pop this out and look and see if there's any damage there, but that looks okay. But it needs to be cleaned. But I don't know. Maybe it doesn't look okay. No, it does not look okay. There's some wear on these pieces here. That looks damaged. And that looks like it's getting worn. I don't know if you can see that. It's tough to see it on the camera. But there's the piece here looks like it's got a lot of wear on it and some damage. And then this piece here looks like it's getting worn. Yeah, it should not look like that. So you know what? We're gonna replace that. Yeah, because that piece there has some movement to it. It's a little freer than it needs to be. Because the other one here, it's held on by a little cross piece. I'm sorry, it's really hard to see, but there's some wear on that one. So we're gonna replace this piece here. In the meantime, I'm going to check to see if putting a throttle body and the valve back in here affects the trigger at all. I don't know if you can see down in there, but I'm just testing this to make sure that it grabbed the throttle valve, which it did. You might be able to see, look inside there. You might be able to see just the tip of the throttle valve. And when I push the trigger in, you can see the throttle valve move. See that right there? The throttle valve tip, you can just see it right there. It moved in like it should have. It's grabbed the trigger, the hook on the back of the trigger grabbed it okay. But there's just a lot of resistance against that trigger. And I'm not sure what's causing it. All right, we're on to something here. Just looking at this trigger, which is the one in question, it looks okay. Nothing seems amiss. I noticed, though, that when I inserted it in the housing, it holds up just when that green O-ring makes contact. And it provides an awful lot of resistance. So I pulled the trigger off of another identical impact that I also have on the bench, and I noticed that the O-ring on this one is very different. A, it's not green, it's black, and B, it's 1 millimeter smaller in diameter. My trusty calipers here. I measured this O-ring Very careful not to compress it at all. Just when the caliper comes into contact, it is 7 millimeters, and that gives me a whole other millimeter to play with. This one is 6, and when we get this correct, that's 6 millimeters. Just to double check and prove it to ourselves, it winds up hitting the O-ring. So I don't know if this was an incorrect O-ring that somebody put on there, maybe in an earlier attempt to fix something, or what. But clearly that's the problem. Everything else seems to be working okay. So we'll order an O-ring for this guy. We'll get the rest of it cleaned up, inspect to see if there's any other things that need to be addressed, but the rest of it looks pretty good. So O-ring for sure for the trigger on this one. Okay, the parts have arrived that we've been waiting on forever. Forgive me if I repeat myself, because so much time has gone by since I shot the first part of this video when I disassembled the unit until now, waiting on parts, that I don't know what I said. So one thing I like to do, as I may have mentioned, is completely clean and degrease all the parts. So we're going to take everything over to the brand new parts washer that I just got. Washer? Yes, I said it. The brand new parts washer that I just got. And we'll test that out, see if it works, put it through its paces, and clean the grease and stuff off of the unit. And then we'll install the new trigger and valve. Here's the new trigger. It does have the O-ring on it that I was hoping to see. So clearly somebody at some point replaced the O-ring on the bad trigger with one that did not belong. And the trigger on here is red, which is no big deal. It's just a different color. You can't buy the O-ring without buying the trigger. This comes as a single unit. So I had to get a new trigger along with it. I couldn't just get the O-ring. So there's that, and then the valve here is looking nice like it should. And every piece here is intact, unlike the other one, which had a lot of wear and some degradation of the pieces inside of it. The first thing we're going to do is put back the throttle valve and put the new trigger and the new valve in there. Now here's the throttle valve assembly, and you have to make sure you put the collar on it that locks it into place. Yes, and that goes, the collar goes along this top section here between those two pieces, and it'll snap right in there once you get it in the proper position. There. And then those are the ears there that catch on to the holes in the handle, here and there. And I'm going to put some grease on all the O-rings and all the fittings here. Being careful not to over lubricate it, because grease will trap dirt, and usually what happens with these guns is owners never disassemble them and clean them. So the grease just builds up over time and gets gummy and disgusting, and that's what causes a number of failures down the line when things just get so gummy they don't work anymore. And the way this goes in is, if you notice, the black O-ring is slightly larger than the blue O-ring, so the black O-ring is the end that goes in through the handle first, and there's a front and back to this, and you determine that by looking at the teeth in here that catch the gearing on the selector switch, and those have to face the rear of the unit. So the way this is going to go in is up through the handle like this, with the tab here facing the back end of the unit, and the half circle facing the front of the unit. And then that pops up and through. Next, we're going to put the selector buttons in. And the teeth are going to go in toward the center like that. You have to have this aligned properly when you insert your selector switches. So you turn it a little bit to get it pointing in one direction, because the way this works is when it's at 45 degrees in one way, it's going to send the air up one side of the motor, and then when you push the selector switches, it rotates it so it's 45 degrees the other way to push up there the other side of the motor, so that's going to determine which direction the motor spins. And when you insert the selector switches, you just got to make sure that this is angled enough to one side so you can get the selector in there. Each side of the selector goes in, again, with the teeth facing the gear on the valve, and I believe you have the valve angled to one side, and that's going to push the gearing out toward the back of this on one end, and then the gearing on the other end is going to be in more. I believe we insert the first selector switch on the end where the gearing is facing back toward the rear of the unit. This goes in with the teeth facing the gear, and also with the hollow pieces here facing up, so they mate with some channels on the top of the cavity here where these go. And as you get this in, you're going to have to push the tab in a little bit to get it past the body. So push that tab in, and then push the selector into the hole. So easy, just like that. There we go. Now if that went in properly, it went in and turned the valve here, and then the other side should just pop right in. Should being the operative word. Yeah, that goes in, then you can see it pushes the other selector out. That goes in. One side goes in, one side goes out, and as you do that, it rotates the valve 45 degrees. Well, I guess it rotates at 90 degrees. I don't know. So there's that, 45 degrees either direction. Next, the trigger goes in. And nothing's going to hold it in yet. That's the job of the throttle body. So we insert the trigger and then just rest it in there like that, being as sure as we can that the hook in that trigger is about center in the housing there, so that when we push in the throttle body valve pin goes through the hook in the trigger. We're going to be careful when we do that. We'll feel some resistance if it doesn't work, and we can adjust it from there. Just go very slow and carefully. And there's no front or back to this. As long as you have it lined up, it'll go in. So now the ears are in. It's the delicate balance of pushing this up enough until the throttle body valve gets in the right position relative to the trigger. So we have to make sure the trigger's pulled out and then slowly, carefully push this guy up. And if you feel resistance, don't force it because you don't want to break anything. There. And once the trigger is springy, you know that the throttle body valve is correctly placed in the hook of the trigger. Otherwise, it wouldn't spring in and out, and it would pull out. So we know that that's correct. Take the rotor assembly and insert it into the housing, the side that has the two holes here that direct the air go down against the valve there. And obviously the selector goes out the back. And that just drops in, and the selector is now flush with the back of the gun. That is correct. I also like to use this opportunity to drop in a few drops of tool oil because the vanes need some lubrication as well as the rotor to go against the housing. I don't like to over lubricate anything because what should happen is the owner should oil this after they use it. They don't always, but there's enough lubrication in here to get them going. And the problem with over lubrication is I have seen where there's too much oil in here, these vanes don't drop out of their slots like they should, and they get hung up. And when they don't drop out of their slots, there's nothing to catch the air as it goes around the rotor, so it winds up not working. So only a little bit of oil will keep these vanes well lubricated and coming out of their slots like they should. Next, this piece goes on, and note that the two holes here are closer together than the two holes down here, and they're going to correspond with the screw holes in the body. These two here are closer together than these two. So this guy just drops on over the assembly, and sometimes that bearing drops out. That's okay, just push that guy in. And then once it's in position, you just line up your holes so that these holes here are all aligned properly. We're going to put this aside and then put together our hammer assembly. Got the cage, the two hammers, and two pins. Note the shape of the hammers. Looks like a ghost with its two little arms up in the air. That goes in one orientation, you pick. And then the other one goes in the opposite orientation. So one goes with his arms up, the other goes with his arms down. They go on top of each other. And there's slots on either side that those pins will drop through. And put this in the cage sideways so that these holes, rather these slots here in the hammers, line up with the holes in the cage. And then just drop in your pins. And just play with the alignment there until the other pin drops in. That's it. Lightly lubricate this with grease. And I don't over lubricate anything because what's going to happen over time is the owner should be lubricating this with grease periodically. And they're probably never going to take the thing apart to clean it. So what happens is you get this buildup of grease. So the lubrication I'm going to be putting in here is going to be adequate for getting them up and running. Then I'll tell them, make sure you lubricate it yourself, occasionally by inserting grease in the Zerk in the hammer cone. Be careful now because when you turn this on its side, these two pins are just free in there. They could drop out. So don't pick this thing straight up or your pins are going to fall out. Rather, tilt it to the side so that the pins stay in there, and then just put some grease all over the hammers, the hammer cage, and all over the assembly. And again, you don't have to go nuts, because what's another problem when grease builds up is that it catches dirt and it traps it, and then it's going to cease to provide the benefit that it's supposed to provide. So with the hammers correctly put in there, you now take the anvil, and that goes in through here, and you just got to finagle with it until it sets down into its position. Watch your pins there, they don't slide out. Then take this guy, and it inserts into the hammer housing, like that. And if I turn this upside down, things are going to drop out, so just be careful. So now I have these two pieces are going to be mated together with the gasket in between. And that gasket has a tab right there. And that gasket is going to set in this notch in the hammer housing. And the orientation matters because of the screw holes. So the holes that are closer together go on the top, and the holes that are further apart go on the bottom. And you have to orient the gasket appropriately. This tab is going to set on the bottom, facing up in this orientation so that it goes into the slot on the hammer housing. Don't turn any of these pieces upside down or right side up. Rather, work with them like on a side, on a horizontal basis, so that you don't drop anything out of where it belongs. And then just carefully mate these two pieces together. Make sure your splines line up correctly, and make sure you don't pinch your gasket. Now, with this on its side, we're going to put in the body screws. Now, when you put pieces together that have a gasket between them, you have to be careful about tightening down the screws that hold those two pieces together. You want to apply pressure evenly to the gasket so that you don't mash it on one side and leave a gap in the other or deform the gasket. So we're going to put these in one at a time, make sure our holes are all lined up, and then we're going to tighten them progressively and using a cross pattern to make sure that we apply even pressure to it. What the what? Is that a problem? Alright, now, do as I say and not as I do on this one. Do not use a power tool to put this piece together again. I'm very familiar with the limitations of this tool, and I've done a million of these. So, I have a driver here with a clutch on it. This is not an impact driver. So we're not going to impact when you hear this thing go brrr. It's because the clutch is letting off, and I can put this on a very light setting. It's the first one we're going to use to drive these in, and we're just going to barely add enough pressure to bring these pieces to bring the parts together. Just like that. That's all we're doing. And then we're going to go on the opposite corner, and we're not even going to bother to put much pressure on this at all, but we want to start applying even pressure to that gasket. All right, that's it. So right now we have even pressure all around. We're going to increase the torque on this just a little bit, and then go around in that same sequence. Now we have a little bit more pressure, and do the same sequence. And a little bit more just to make sure it's all sealed up right and we have enough clamping force on the screws. Okay, roll back together again. Double check our selectors. Those seem to be working great. Check our speed control here. Oof. My carpal tunnel prevents me from doing that, so we gotta grab a little helper. This guy. Yep, works great. Let's take it out to the compressor and test it. All right, I hooked this up to the compressor. Houston, we've got a problem. Air's coming out through the vent here and also out the back by the selector. So something's obviously wrong with maybe the valve. Well, I don't know. I mean, if it's coming out through here, it's passing into the rotor housing. It may have something up with the vanes in the rotor. We have to disassemble it and check it out. I did not disassemble this entirely, if you remember. And I am going to say that I probably should have. As I'm guessing, maybe it just needs to be cleaned, so we're going to run it through a cleaning cycle. We take the selector switch off, this pulls off. There's a snap ring in the bottom that holds the rotor in there. Just pop that off, and then the rotor pops out and all the vanes come out. So we're going to put it through a cleaning cycle more thoroughly than we did before. Pull it straight out. And you got your snap ring in there. Snap ring comes out, and then the rotor just drops out of the housing. And watch that you don't lose the vanes, because they're just going to fall out of there. So we'll put all this stuff in the parts washer. All right, everything's been put through the parts washer, and it is blew air from the compressor just to dry it all out. So I'm guessing we're good to go. Give it a whirl and see where we are. All right, put it back together again. First thing you do is you put the rotor back in the rotor housing and make sure that the bearing in the back is pressed down into the housing, because that'll pop up. It'll expose this groove that you put the snap ring around. Snap ring. Just put it on there. Now make sure that that snap ring is in place. If it's not, you're going to have a sad time. So make sure by pushing it down that it's snapped into place, and then wiggle it around a little bit, try to pry it a little bit, make sure it does not pop out, because if that pops out while the tool is being used, it's you got to take it all apart and put it back together again. So that ounce of prevention now is worth a pound of cure later on. That seems like it's in pretty good shape. And now we insert the vanes back into the rotor. These guys have a right way and a wrong way of going in. There's a square notch here and just an angled end there. See if you can see it better. Square notch and the angled end. The square notch goes toward the front, this face here. And insert them at the top of the housing so you have room. Otherwise, you can't fit this in there because it doesn't have enough space. So with the long flat side going against the inside of the rotor housing and the square notch facing out, drop them in. All right, now we can see this much better. If we turn this, then you can see how the vanes drop down out of their slots like they should. This is my lesson in actually doing what I say. That one's not dropping out. And making sure that everything gets cleaned properly. Because I did not do what I said I do. Tried to take a shortcut by not disassembling this, because as far as I knew there was no problem with it. And I paid the price by having to go back and redo it. Learn from my failures. All right, a little bit of tool oil. Keep it lubed up. Again, not very much, just a few drops. Work that around in there. We'll put the selector back on this tab here, right there. That goes into that slot in the housing, and that just presses in. And leave that O-ring exposed there, that black O-ring, that stays out because that's going to seal against the back of the housing. And that just drops in until the selector is flush with the back of the gun. And the splines are sticking up about a 1/4 inch beyond the rim. This guy goes back, remembering to keep the holes oriented properly. Make sure your holes are aligned. They're a little bit off. There we go. Put your gasket on properly with the tab going toward the trigger, facing up. Then very carefully take your hammer assembly and its housing. Line everybody up with the splines and then just drop that in place so that the notch in the housing mates with the notch or the tab in the gasket. I'm just putting these in enough to make sure the holes are aligned. I'm not tightening them down yet. Okay. On the lowest setting. Here we go. Alright, let's take it back out to the compressor. Now, are you going to laugh at my pain or thrill at my victory? Let's find out. Yeah, let this be a lesson, kids. Clean it. All of it. That's one direction. That's the other direction. That's on high. Oof. That's medium. That's low. I have learned my lesson with this. I hope you have also learned my lesson by watching my failures and making sure you don't repeat what I've done. Clean it. All of it. Every time. It's always worth it in the end, and shame on me for trying to take a shortcut, because clearly it didn't work, and it only came back to bite me and cost me more time. Of course, that's unbillable time. I can't charge the customer for that. So that's on me, and it's my bad. But at least this is now in perfect working condition. Aside from that little hiccup, this thing came apart and went back together again flawlessly. That is typical of what you would see with these things being disassembled and reassembled. And I got a chance to use my new parts washer. So all in all, it was a success, and I'm glad I had a chance to use the parts washer and work out a new problem with this. Interestingly, with that O-ring on the trigger, that seemed to be the cause of all the problems. Now keep watching, because in the future, we've got some great other air tool repair videos, including another Ingersoll 2235TiMAX that had a problem with the gasket and with the body screws, and we have some more coming up as well that include an older Ingersoll air impact and some ratchets. So do me a favor, click down here now to subscribe so that you don't miss any of it. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, use a tool. Don't be one.